Hi, in this video we're going to explore observations as a form of data collection. It's very often associated with ethnography, but it can also be used in many other methodologies. So with an observation, we're moving beyond what people say. Observation provides the opportunity to explore what people are actually doing in a meaningful and relevant environment. So it's a really powerful form of data collection. An interesting point to start with is to consider this quote, which is that all scientific research requires careful observation. So whilst it's true in the broad sense, when we talk about observation as a scientific, as a specific research method, we're talking about something more focused. We think about the way that we systematically watch and record behaviour and interactions, and we see them in their natural context as they naturally occur. A key word here is systematic. This is not a casual observation. When we're planning and when we're engaged in observation, what's subjective to us, what's of interest to us, we need to move beyond that, and we need to use a structured approach so we can be objective and, as I said, systematic. Systematic is important, and it should guide this process. So what are the key features of observation? Firstly, the researcher is a witness to the events firsthand. So whereas with most qualitative data, we have the participant's interpretation, which we as researchers then interpret ourselves, in this context, we don't have the interpretation of the participant, instead of which we're seeing them, we're seeing what they actually do, how they actually act, how the interactions are in that space. So this makes it super powerful. It provides really rich contextual data. So as we've got here from Cohen and Mannion, the observation enables us to gather information about the physical setting, the human setting, the interactional setting, and the program setting. When do we use observation? Well, they're best suited for understanding behaviour in natural contexts. So if you want to understand social dynamics, let's say in a rehearsal, or to witness a teaching process unfold in real time, or to verify claims made in an interview, observation is one way of doing this. The types of questions at the bottom of this slide are well suited to the use of observation. They're questions about demonstratable actions and processes, and as such they make them perfect fit for observations. So, like all rigorous research, observation really begins with careful planning. If we engage with observation without that planning, it's very likely that we're going to engage in a way that means that we write down the things that are of particular interest to us. And that means that we're likely to be biased. We're going to inadvertently find the things of interest to us, the things that we want to see, even if we don't mean to do that. So we need to be systematic. We need to think about our research question, and then we need to think about what's the data we need to collect to be able to answer that question. For instance, are we looking to pick up on things like verbal cues, what's said? Or perhaps we're thinking about the interactions, the face-to-face physical interactions of people. Perhaps you might look at the time that students spend on a task, for instance, or the way that the teacher talks, how long the teacher talks, things like this. Another thing you want to think about is where and when you're going to conduct your observation. So what's the context? So are you going to look to find something that's representative, or perhaps you're going to look for an extreme or an unusual event? So choosing where and when we observe things is really important here as well. You need to decide how long you're going to observe each session for. Are you going to watch the whole session? So let's say it's a teaching session, it lasts 45 minutes. Are you going to stay for the whole class? Or perhaps you're just going to look at part of the session, perhaps a bit in the middle or the bit at the end. So before we get to actually do our observation, it's really important that we make plans for exactly what we're going to collect. And particularly if we're walking in somebody else's space, we need to be aware that they're informed of these choices as well. So once you've settled upon the data you're collecting, you've done some planning, we need to think about the tools we need for our observations. So field notes are the most common tool. That's going to be quite often just a notepad, and we're going to jot down notes in it. Those are likely to be descriptive accounts of what you see and hear, based upon your planning. However, it's also the case that sometimes what you might choose to do is to have a pre-made checklist or a schedule of some form. These can be really helpful, particularly for more quantitative things. So for instance, if you're looking at the number of times that students ask questions or interact in particular ways, you could have a checkbox, and each time you see a particular act, you tick it off on your box, and perhaps you put a timestamp or you put a quick comment about what it was that you saw, what was the nature of the question, that kind of thing. So obviously for that to work, you're going to have to plan to have that sheet ahead of time. So you want those pre-printed, and you need to make sure you have way more than you think you could possibly need. You might choose to use audio or video to help you record a session, but this comes with some bonuses, obviously, because you were recording it, but it also comes with some issues. One of the key ones is going to be consent, and you're going to need to have consent from everybody in the space if you're going to audio record or video record, so that can be a challenge. And you need to make sure you get the consent of both the parents and of the students, particularly if they're younger people. And it might seem like getting a video camera or audio recording will make things easier, but very often a video camera you won't allow you to capture the entire space. You'll get part of the space. So you might think, perhaps I'll set up 2 cameras or 3 cameras to make sure that I get everything. Well, at that point, you've got 3 times the data to watch. But also, having 3 cameras on 3 tripods is likely to have an impact on how people interact in that classroom. So we need to be really careful. The whole point of observation is to see natural responses in a natural environment. And if we place cameras everywhere, we're going to influence that. Similarly, with audio, that can lead to issues in terms of, if I have a single audio recorder and we have lots of children, let's say 30 people in a class, actually how useful is that? If we're trying to get the conversations the children are having, that probably won't work. There's going to be too much background noise. We're just going to hear lots and lots of noise and talk and nothing that we can actually use, not anything particularly practical anyway. So all of this kind of planning is important to be done and well ahead of time. During the observation, particularly if you're taking notes, physical notes, you need to be really disciplined. It's very easy to drop into more sort of subjective ways of viewing it. You need to make sure that you're attentive, you're disciplined, you stick to your plan. You need to find a suitable place for you to sit. You need to make sure that you're there without being overly obtrusive. You need to be ready to record your notes systematically, but also, particularly in classroom situations, that out of the blue, one of the children might come and talk to you, for instance. So you need to be ready for all of these kind of eventualities and how you're going to deal with it. Critically, you've also, in the moment where you're actually recording, you need to be clear about what's interpretation and what's description. In the moment when you're observing, you need to be describing what you're seeing rather than interpreting it. The whole point is to capture as much detail as you can, as objectively as possible. So this is kind of a key feature during the observation. As already stated, the choice of what to record in your film notes is something that should be driven by your research question and should be planned well in advance. But this list is quite useful as a guide to the different things that you might want to focus on when you're doing that planning. So you might think you've done your observation, the class or the session or whatever it is that you're looking at is finished and that's the end. But actually it's not, it's far from it. The immediate time after the session finishes that you've been observing is really critical, because this is when everything is fresh in your mind. So one thing that you might want to plan for is where you go next directly after the observation. So it might be that you know there's a nearby coffee shop, and as soon as you finish your observation, the very next thing that you're going to do is to go to that coffee shop. You'll get away from the situation. You know that you can spend an hour there to go back through your notes and to write them up. And there are probably 2 things that need to happen here. One is you going through and collating your notes, kind of reviewing them, reflecting on them, and making sure that objective data is solid. Perhaps you are halfway through writing a comment when something else happened on your notes, and you never got to finish that comment. So this time directly after the interview is the right time just to finish off a comment that you were making that you kind of got disrupted. It's also an important time directly afterwards to begin that evaluation process where you're going to be turning your raw data into meaningful findings. That immediate time directly afterwards, everything is fresh in your mind, so the interpretations are going to be stronger. So it's really important this time directly after the interview of the observation. So it's not that the observation finishes and a few days later you go back and reflect. You need to be there, probably planning an hour or two directly after your observation to engage in that process. A bit like all of these other methods, there are different variants that you can draw upon and use. Two key observation approaches. One is a participant observation, the other is non-participant observation. So with a participant observation, you're going to actively join in the activity. So let's imagine that you're observing a choir. Rather than sitting on the side, you're actually probably going to take part in the choir for the session and sing and be chatting to the people alongside you. This is really good. It's immersive. You get an insider perspective. The challenge here is, how do you keep your notes? How can you be objective? How can you ensure that you've got that detailed report of what you're observing? So that's one of the challenges there, but you get under the skin of a group. Non-participant observation is in some ways easier, but the risk of that is that you're the outsider, so perhaps you don't get under the skin in quite the same way. Another way of thinking about observation is whether things are structured or unstructured. So with a structured observation, you're going to go in with a clear plan of the things you're looking for. So this is the type that I've mostly been talking about up until now. You're thinking about, I'm looking for perhaps the verbal cues, how the students talk to each other, or perhaps you're looking for how the teacher teaches a particular thing. That's the key thing. In an unstructured observation, you're not going to go in those kind of preconditioned ideas. You're going to be a lot more open to what you view. Now, in some ways, that can be better because you're getting richer data. You're seeing what hits you at the time and you're writing it down immediately. However, it's obviously open to bias and subjectivity. It's less structured, it's less systematic. So it comes with a risk from those particular things. So here are a list of potential pitfalls that you need to observe. A key one here is the Hawthorne effect, and that's that people behave differently simply because they know they're being watched. So we need to be really aware, whilst we think that this data is rich and it's valid and it doesn't have the problem of double interpretation on it, actually people might not be behaving in the way they typically do. For that reason, it might be sometimes that you plan to go in on multiple occasions so that people get used to you being there and that their behaviour over time modifies and changes. So that's one thing to consider. As we've talked about a few times now, observation biased, observer bias. How do you know that what you're viewing, what you're observing is objective, as opposed to you selecting things based on your innate bias? There are issues of you becoming native, getting too involved and losing analytical distance. There are potential issues around recording equipment not capturing what you want, particularly if you're relying on that. Perhaps either your recording fails altogether, or when you view it back, you realise that you've captured the wrong thing for things that you wanted to capture, you haven't for whatever reason. There are clearly ethical complexities here. Particularly with young people, we have this issue where if you're working with a group of young people, what if some of them haven't given consent? How do you manage that? And then there's the problem of you failing to observe systematically, say this kind of observer bias. There are lots of key strengths though. It can lead to really authentic data, and arguably it catches behavioural data better than any other method. It allows you to see what people actually do in their natural setting, and that provides direct mediated access to their actions. So that, I guess, is the most key thing here, the most important thing. There are lots of other reasons why you might want to do it, and this sheet's got lots of different other bits and pieces on it, but the key thing is about the richness of the data. So again, this is a really short overview, all things considered, about how you might plan for doing an observation. If you're thinking of taking part and engaging in observation, then it's really important that you do a bit of further reading. These are some books you might want to go and look at. There are lots of others you might want to consider. All of the core texts on research methods in education will cover observations. So go and find one of those books, read in more detail about how you prepare, and think about all of the different strengths, weaknesses, and limitations that you're going to have to address. I'll see you in the next video.